No worries. Do I sound okay? All right.
Thank you so much for joining me, JD. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am very well. Thank you very much. I appreciate you making some time for me. This is fantastic.
Oh, it's Friday. I'm like, it's been about 2 hours since my last cup of coffee, so I hope I can keep up.
Well, awesome. You have just, gosh, so much going on. You've had a fascinating career trajectory. What was it like getting your start kind of in entertainment journalism?
Hey, I've had a crazy roller coaster ride, and I keep waiting for this thing to come to a grinding halt, and it feels like the roller coaster just keeps climbing higher and higher. I started back in college. I was in at the Art Institute in Fort Lauderdale. I was working on a business degree, a music degree. I ultimately got a degree in IT. While I was doing all that, I got a job at BMG Distribution, which is a division of RCA Records. And I was essentially a glorified babysitter. So I'd have to pick up recording artists at the airport, get them to the radio stations for their interviews, get them to their concert, get them to their hotel. If you've ever seen that movie, Get Them to the Greek, that was essentially my life. And going to college is expensive, and I realized I had some very famous people in the car with me, sometimes for a week at a time. So I started to interview them, and then I would sell those interviews to magazines like Tiger Beat, Teen People, 17 magazine, and to really date myself, this was people like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson, New Kids on the Block, hardcore, right in the middle of the 90s. But yeah, that's where I basically started. And when you work with anybody in newspapers and magazines, you quickly realize they've got a novel at some stage of development. It's in a desk drawer. They've been working on it for the last 10 years. It's almost done. It's 400,000 words. They feel like it needs a little something. So they would hand those off to me. I was kind of initially the guy they would give it to for like grammar and punctuation. I was really good at that sort of thing, but I kind of twisted that, and it turned into like developmental edits and critiques on the story and kind of helping them shape it. And I kept with it. After I graduated college, I ended up working in business. My last real job, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds. So I would come home at night and I would work on these books to try to keep my head on straight. I did that for 23 years.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And it really is this. It's a fascinating way to get your kind of your foot in the door. That's amazing. What drew you to writing in the first place?
It's something I've always done. I was born in the 70s. Like we had a TV, but we got three channels, so there was nothing worth watching. But I always had my head buried in a book. I love books. I love the fact that you could just open the cover and kind of get lost in a story. Go to some place you've never been, meet people you've never met before. It always fascinated me. So from a very early age, I would write stuff up. I had a sister who was 15 months younger than me. So I would write up these stories. I would staple them together. I made like a little library in my room. She would check them out. I'd charge her late fees. So this dates back a really really long time. But my parents, they drilled into my head like writing is a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job, which is how I ended up in the corporate world.
I understand. I heard the same things from college professors, so I understand completely. Now, what were you reading at a young age?
I was all over the place. I read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries by the time I got into kindergarten, so that was kind of my introduction. From there, I moved on to the classics like Charles Dickens and Mark Twain. Very first adult book I ever picked up was Dracula. My mom owned an antique store. We used to go to a lot of garage sales, and I found a copy of it in a box of books for 25 cents. Picked it up, and I figured she'd never let me buy it because it looked very scary, very adult, and I was like 8 years old at the time. But she let me, and I loved it. I mean, I think it scared the crap out of me, and I think that's what really drew me into writing. The fact that a book could bring out like that kind of emotional reaction. Like I had to leave the lights on for weeks after reading that book, and that just it stuck with me, and it's something I wanted to recreate as I got older.
That's amazing. Now, what kind of things were you putting together for your sister? What kind of like stories were you telling her?
Oh, I'm sure they were probably horrible. We lived in a house in the middle of a forest. Everybody thought the forest was haunted. I remember there being a ghost motorcycle gang at one point that all the kids would talk about.
Wow.
Obviously none of this stuff was real, but like, one kid would tell another one, they would tell five, they would tell 10, and before you knew it, it was local legend. So I wrote up stuff about that.
That's amazing. So your first book, Forsaken, kind of announced you as an author to watch. What was that like going through that?
That was a crazy experience. I ended up indie publishing the book, but Stephen King read an early copy of it and he let me use some of his characters from Needful Things in it. And that really, really helped it. I mean, it put me on the radar of a lot of people that probably wouldn't have seen me, from the get-go. Ultimately, it sold a lot of copies, and when I came out with my second book, it helped me score a really nice deal in the traditional world.
That's amazing. What was it like kind of, putting this out and then all of a sudden all of these eyes are on you and you're kind of getting this buzz.
It's weird. I mean, it wasn't like an overnight thing. So the book, we launched it. And if you've ever indie published a book, I mean, you do everything you can to make it as good as possible, but then ultimately you have to hit that publish button, and then it's kind of off into the world. And it sold okay. I mean, it sold a couple copies the first day, a few more the next day. I mean, nothing crazy. But I hired a friend of mine who used to work in the music business doing PR, and we started brainstorming ways to kind of light a fire underneath the title. And I told her, about the Stephen King thing. And ultimately, like I'll give you a little backstory on it. In the story, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. So just to explain that, to get to that last page on paper, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and fully expected to have to change that. My wife convinced me to try and get King's permission to use it. So we were in Florida. My mom has a house about 10 minutes or so from King's house. So we printed up the manuscript. We hopped in the car and we figured we'll head on over. We'll be outside gardening or something. I'll hand him the book. He'll give me a big thumbs up and we'll be on our way. It didn't work out that way. So King lives on a little island called Casey Key. If you make a left, you go over a tiny bridge. You make a left, you go to the public portion of this key. And if you make a right, it's like basically the entire half of this island that he owns. There's a private drive sign and no trespassing sign. We ran into a gate. There was another gate. Ultimately, we turned around. We gave up. We went to a restaurant back at the bridge. I called a friend of mine who knew King and told him what we were doing. And he said, "Yeah, don't stalk Steve. Here's an email address. If he likes the book, he'll get back to you. If the book's shit, he probably won't reply." And King, a couple days later, sent me an email back. It was really nice, and he told me, go ahead and use it. Let me know if let him know if I need anything. He's very, very supportive. So I told my friend this, the one who was working in PR, and she said, "You know what? That's the story. This kid who's never worked in the publishing industry before, writes a debut novel, heads over to Stephen King's house. Like that's what we need to write up." And she pitched that, and Publishers Weekly ended up writing a story about that. My failed attempt to get to Stephen King's house, and that's what really lit up the book because librarians read that, bookstore owners read that, and all of a sudden the title was on the radar.
That is amazing. Now, coming from kind of indie publishing into kind of the more traditional world, how have you kind of seen how like the big differences between the two? I mean, obviously there's a world apart, but like kind of how has it been coming from one world into the next?
Well, honestly, getting a taste of the indie publishing thing, it kind of messed me up because I had been working for the traditional publishers for all those years. So when I did that, all of a sudden I had all this freedom. I got to create my own cover. I got to, create my own title for the book. I hired my own people for formatting, for editing, but I had like 100% total control over everything. So when I signed that next deal for my follow-up book, with the traditional publisher, that was with HMH, which is part of HarperCollins now. I had to give all that up. All of a sudden I had an editor and they were in charge of everything. And I couldn't even tell you what date the book was coming out on, until they told me.
Oh,
So it was just the opposite end. And the financial, there were some stark differences there. As an indie author, you get roughly 70 cents on the dollar. And as a traditionally published author, they give you a nice big advance check at the beginning, but you've got to pay that back. And you have to pay it back in these small little incremental payments. You're lucky if you get 15 to 20 cents on the dollar. So it takes a long time to pay that money back. So like all these things kind of glared out at me. But I swallowed that pill because the traditional publishers can get your book in a lot of places that you can't get into as an indie. You can get into Costco, you can get into Walmart, Target, grocery stores, all these places that indie authors just normally don't get. So to me, that was worth that trade-off. So I did a couple of books for the traditional publishers. Then about 3 or 4 books in, I wrote one called The Caller's Game. And at that point, I was fairly established. I reached out to my agent and I told her, listen, I'm going to go ahead and publish this one in English on my own through my own indie press. You can go ahead and sell the foreign rights like you normally do. And at that point, I was in about 150 different countries, a few dozen languages. So it was still a pretty big market. But we did that for the next couple of books. It was kind of a hybrid approach to publishing. So I got to retain some of that control and the profits and things that I missed. But I still had, the traditional publishers in the foreign markets, which, is much more difficult to publish anyway. So I really didn't want to have to deal with that. And that worked out very well for my next couple of books. And then fast forward to about a year and a half ago, I wrote a book called Behind a Closed Door, and I sent it off to my agent at Writer's House. He started shopping it. We immediately got an offer for a film deal, which we ended up signing. And that sparked the traditional publishers. And it looked like the book was going to go to auction. We had about four or five of the big guys that wanted it. And right before that auction was supposed to happen, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked at Random House. And she said, "Listen, we're about to offer on your book. You need to turn it down when it comes in." And I asked her why, and she said, "Well, Random House is about to lay off a lot of people, and the editor who wants your book is on that list." And I got a similar phone call from a friend of mine at HarperCollins. So I had to take a step back because if you've ever had a book with a publisher where you lose your editor, that book can end up in limbo forever, because
Wow.
they've got the rights to publish it. So until somebody decides to pick it up and run with it, it can just sit there. So I reached back to some friends of mine that I knew in the finance world. Simon and Schuster had just recently gotten bought by a private equity firm. So I started these back channel conversations, and ultimately I struck a deal with Simon and Schuster, where I created my own imprint, but with Simon and Schuster handling the print sales and distribution. And that's where I'm at today. And honestly, I think it's the best of both worlds because I can put out any book I want whenever I want. So I've got total control like an indie author would, but Simon and Schuster is handling the back end, which means I can get into all those places that I couldn't get into before. So I honestly think that that's where a lot of this industry is going. I think you're going to see a lot of the large indie authors, they're going to realize that this makes a lot of sense. And you're going to see them start signing deals with, Random House, HarperCollins, and these other guys. And from a publishing standpoint, I think they recognize it too. Because the big publishers are watching those indie sales very closely. And then when they see somebody, doing really well, they try to court that person. They try to bring them in and sign them. But an indie author that's doing well really has very little incentive to sign that deal. But, if you strike a hybrid deal like what I've got going on, it makes a lot more sense.
That's amazing. And it's interesting because you come from the background you do, like it gives you kind of a better view on the business sense. So you kind of have a leg up on a lot of other authors and creatives. So that's amazing.
Yeah, I wouldn't trade the indie experience at all because that forced me to learn every single aspect of this business. And there's a lot of things that indies can do that the traditional guys can't. I always liken them to, like, if you think of ships in a harbor, a traditional author is like a giant cruise ship. So just making a turn, turning that boat around could take hours. It's a huge project. Indie author is more like a little speedboat. They can zip in and out. They can make decisions on the fly. They see something like TikTok come out of nowhere and books start selling there. They can have a campaign running within an hour. Traditional publishers just can't do that. So, I've taken a lot of the experience that I've learned on the indie side and brought it over to the traditional world.
That is amazing. Now since you had started, you've worked on your own novels and you've co-authored works. How did that come about?
I love co-authoring. So if you go back to what I was doing before, working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, I was always working with other people. They would bring me a book that was, half baked or needed some work, so I would work with that original author. I would work with an agent, work with the editor to fine tune that book. So when I started writing my own books, all of a sudden I'm all by myself at a desk, and I kind of missed having that interaction. I got lucky with about the first one. Forsaken was up for it was up for best debut horror novel through the Horror Writers Association. And I went there for the award, and I ran into Dacre Stoker, who's Bram's great grandnephew. We ended up sitting next to each other for a book signing, and I talked to him for about an hour. Asked him tons of questions about Bram Stoker. He, asked me a bunch of stuff about, working as a ghostwriter and a book doctor and my past experience. I didn't realize it, but at the time, it was actually a job interview. He knew who I was. And so at another point in the conference, he pulled me aside and said, "Listen, the family has read Forsaken. We really like your writing style. We like your background. We've been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a while now using Bram's original notes. Is that something you'd be interested in doing?" And, obviously you don't say no to a project like that. So that was my first high profile co-authored project. While that was going on, my second book was coming out. It was about a serial killer in Chicago called The Fourth Monkey. And the traditional publishers, whenever a book is coming out, they scattershot, copies of that book to all the big name authors, hoping to get that, quote for the back of the cover. And in this case, James Patterson was one of the people on the list for that book. We had hoped for a blurb, but ultimately he liked the book enough where he reached out to me and asked if I wanted to co-author with him. And the very first one was Coast to Coast Murders. That was a few years back. We've actually got number five coming out in a few months in March, called The Writer. So we're having a ball working together.
That is amazing. Now with working with Dacre Stoker. How intimidating was that to kind of step into? I mean, classic almost feels like it's too small of a word for a work like Dracula. Like, were you intimidated at all?
I think if anything, I mean, Dracula I had mentioned was the first adult book I ever read. So it's always had a special place in my heart. I've read it more times than I can count at this point. I think what really intimidated me though, there are people out there who actually have doctorate degrees in Dracula. At this point, they know that novel inside and out. They know the lore. They know the history. That's what scared me because I like just being able to go in and literally just make up a story. Just have fun telling a story. But there were a lot of things that I had to hold true to that original book. Luckily, the Stoker family, we had access to everything that Bram Stoker had when he wrote the original Dracula. And a lot of people don't realize this, but like he started Dracula when he was in his 40s, the book, but he started researching it when he was as young as 16. We actually found notes when he was in Trinity University that he had made when he was just a teenager related to vampires. So this is something he'd been working on his entire life. His journals were very detailed. His handwriting's terrible, but he had tons of notes. And like stuff like he researched vampire lore in every culture around the world, which I found fascinating because literally every culture has some type of vampire legend, and a lot of these legends exist long before we all started hopping in boats and sailing and talking to each other. So like that'll in Bram's eyes that meant that there was some kind of truth behind all of that, and you can kind of see that like the truth is somehow buried in all the fiction and the lore that came out later. So picking through his notes, I don't know if it was intimidating. I found it. I enjoyed the process in a lot of ways. It felt like I was actually writing with Bram Stoker. Um, but we had a lot of fun writing that book.
That's amazing. Now, writing with someone, what does that process look like on your end?
Well, I mean, because I have done it for so long, I've gotten fairly good at it. And one of the first things I do is I try to figure out where everybody's strengths and weaknesses are. It's very similar to making breakfast. If you've got two people in the kitchen and you're both trying to make eggs at the same time, you run into each other. It's a problem. But if one person's making bacon and another person's making eggs, it all kind of makes sense. So with Dacre, when we sat down, I looked at some of the writing that he'd done in the past, and he will admit to the fact that he is not a fiction writer. He was a history teacher. His writing is very dry. It's extremely detailed. He knows this stuff inside and out, but it's not fiction. He doesn't have that kind of pacing there, that kind of storytelling ability. So we kind of divided and conquered a little bit. So if I needed to know something like what did Bram Stoker's bedroom look like when he was 6 years old, Dacre was able to tell me right down to the pieces of furniture and where they were laid out in the room. So I was able to capitalize on that knowledge base and then pull it into the fiction and kind of weave it into the story that we wanted to tell.
That's amazing. I've seen that you've had a couple works optioned for films. Where do those stand?
Those I always call it Hollywood hell. Like I've got 8 different projects in various stages of Hollywood hell. So literally everything I've written has been optioned, with the exception of Forsaken. And the funny thing is, it's because of the Stephen King thing. Like I never thought about this at the beginning, but that always trips everybody up. Like they want to make the movie. They think it'd make a great R-rated scary Friday night kind of date movie. But they start digging into it, and then when they realize that the Stephen King tie-in is there, the lawyers get involved, and they're like, well, now we've got to get permission and Needful Things is optioned by so and so they've got to sign off on it. This person's got to sign off, and lawyers have a habit of scaring everybody, so everybody just kind of backs away slowly. So all the other projects, they're all in various stages. Like this one's got a writer, this one's got a director, this one's got a showrunner, this one's got a star. Then we lose a director, we replace them with somebody else. It's somebody once told me if you watch the credits at the end of a movie, 5 or 6 minutes worth of names flying by on your screen, everybody there had to be there in order for that movie to get done. So you lose one of those people, and all of a sudden you don't have a finished film anymore. And you really see that when you start, when your books get optioned, because there's so many moving parts. Everything's got to come together in this perfect storm. To give you an example, Caller's Game, when I wrote that one, I purposely wrote it thinking I want to try and write something that can't be optioned, that can't be filmed, because at that point I'd gotten a little cocky, like everything had gotten optioned, and I was like, I'm going to try and make something that they can't. Immediately, Ridley Scott's company picked it up, so like that was off the table. What I learned is it just comes down to money. Like everything can be filmed. It just the price tag changes. But one day I was sitting around at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night. I get a call from my agent. He's like, Jennifer Garner wants to do this movie. So all of a sudden, Jennifer Garner is on board. Jennifer Garner had what's called a first look deal with Netflix, meaning Netflix, the studio, gets to decide whether or not they want to make a movie if she's interested in it. So within a couple weeks, we had Jennifer Garner. Netflix was on board. We had $100 million budget. All these things kind of came together inside of 2 or 3 weeks. Then about a week after that, we got another phone call. Jennifer Garner's got a scheduling conflict, so she's out. That meant Netflix went away, our budget went away, and we were right back to where we started from. And literally every project I've got has been like that. It's just this crazy, wild ride. So from my standpoint, I just keep writing the books. I just keep my head down, write the next book. It's a numbers game. I think sooner or later we're going to see something hit the screen.
That's got to be nerve-wracking but exciting. So that's awesome. Are you excited? I assume, are you excited for that day to come, or you just kind of just it happens, it happens?
Yeah, it's exciting, but I can't let it overwhelm me because like it's one of those things, like when your agent calls you, it's always either really good news or really bad news on the film and TV side. There's no in between for those folks. So it'll distract me. Like if I get that call in the morning, then I don't get any work done. I don't get any writing done. If I get it at night, I don't get any sleep, which means I don't get any work done the next day. So half the time I don't even want to pick up the phone, like when my agent calls. But it's all part of the game. You got to work with it.
That's what I absolutely can understand that. No, we'll go for one of the old chestnut questions, but I always think it's interesting. What kind of things inspire you? What keeps you like the fire's going for you?
I, for me, just writing the next book, I've got so many different ideas I want to do, but there's always one that jumps out at me. They all come together in very different ways. I don't think I've had two books that have come together the same way. And that keeps it fresh too. I change up my writing method all the time. I primarily write on Scrivener, but you can kind of see it in the corner. I've got a typewriter next to my fireplace over there. I've got a book I've been working on the typewriter. I've got another one that I've been writing in longhand. And I find that my voice is different, if I change up the
Huh.
medium. So that kind of thing keeps it interesting. But I literally get paid to make stuff up. Like you can't get a better job than this.
That is amazing. Wh- with kind of the influx of AI and everything, how are you seeing the whole kind of world of the writer and publishing changing or prognosticating a little? How do you think it'll change?
I've tried to stay on top of it. So I've tried pretty much all of them. My favorite is Claude. It seems that from a writing standpoint, it seems to be pretty strong. I've used it for things like creating Facebook ads, copy for ads. If I need the text for the back of a book, I'll drop the entire novel in there and tell Claude to summarize this in 200 words for the back of the paperback, and it'll do a pretty good job. Where you can just clean it up. So it's a good time saver for things like that. I haven't found it useful when it comes to like brainstorming a project. And if you think about it, the way AIs are put together, I mean, you're literally talking to an encyclopedia, so it can only repeat, what it's already heard, what's already basically been done before. And when you're writing thrillers, which is what I primarily do, you've got to come up with stuff outside of the box. You've got to come up with things that haven't been done before. From like an AI standpoint, 1 plus 1 always equals 2. If you're writing a thriller, you need to make 1 plus 1 equal 3. It's got to be something different. It's funny, like the contrast, like I work with James Patterson, so like we'll call each other and brainstorm book ideas, and like the things that he will come up with are so out of left field, so different and so strange. Like that's why the books sell. That's why they're intriguing. And AI just isn't there yet. It's at this point, it's not capable of an original thought. That being said, I mean, it has progressed extremely fast. I wouldn't be surprised if that day comes sooner rather than later, and it does have an original thought, and then all of a sudden it is capable of writing a novel. I'm not sure what that means just yet.
Yeah, that's it's gonna be interesting to say the least. Something I wanted to ask you about. So your book, something I keep upstairs, is about a haunted house. Have you had any experiences with hauntings or anything weird like that?
That book, it came together again in a very weird way. So I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth called Newcastle. And I actually use Newcastle in that book. I go for a run every day. I do about 4.5 miles. I basically do a lap around the island. And part of that run, I cross the beach. And if you're standing on the beach and you look out over the water, there's a tiny little island about a quarter mile off the coast. The only thing on that island is a little white house with a red roof. That's like you can see it. You can kind of tell that there's something going on out there, but it's far enough away where you really can't tell, what it's really all about. So I started researching everything I could on that island. I got to know the people that owned it, and ultimately that's where the book was born. So in the story, something I keep upstairs, that house is privately owned, and the woman who owns it, she passes away, and she leaves it to her grandson. So 17 years old, he inherits a house on a private island, all to himself, along with a pretty substantial bank account. So he does what every other teenager would do. He invites his friends out there and they start throwing parties. It's one of those places like in real life. It's right on the border of New Hampshire and Maine. If you talk to the local police departments, nobody really knows who's supposed to police that because it's on that border. It's out in the water. So is that the Coast Guard? Is it the local PD? Nobody knows. Everybody just points fingers at each other. So it kind of makes it the perfect place to hang out if you're kids. So but eventually partying just kind of gets old, and somebody brings up this idea like, what would it take to make this house haunted? It's a perfectly ordinary house. The tagline for the book is for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So you know where they're going, but they start off with things like Ouija boards and stuff like that, and then it just gradually progresses. But it was a crazy fun story to write. The fact that it's based on a real house, I think, adds a lot to it. And as part of the promotion, we're doing something really fun. We're actually on the date of publication, which is May 13th. We're drawing a name, and one lucky person is going to get to spend the night in that house with three of their friends. So we're going to bring them out there by boat, drop them off on the dock, and we're not going to come back for them for 24 hours. So they're going to get to spend the night in this haunted house. And the house itself, I mean, it's got a crazy history. Like the island was used during the Spanish-American War to house prisoners. It was a quarantine zone for during the yellow fever, when that was going on. And then back in 1972, somebody was out there picnicking, and they found two bodies buried on the beach. And like I pulled everything I could on this. I reached out. There's only one newspaper article that was written. The local police punted it to the FBI. FBI in today's world, they've got no record of it. The local police have no record of it. So the only thing that actually exists is this newspaper story saying these bodies were found, but there's no actual investigation. So nobody knows who they were or what happened with them. So a lot of local lore and stories have come from that. But it's one of those places, a lot of people have said they've seen people, walking on the shores at night, seen lights on in the house when there shouldn't be because nobody actually lives out there. It is a spooky, creepy place.
That's amazing. That's I I can see why you'd be so inspired. Holy cow. Now have you're such an established voice now. Have you had the chance to meet anybody that's, you've kind of inspired or that you have, kind of influenced yet?
I run into that more and more, and it's so satisfying, to hear that. I mean, I love working with other authors. I mentor authors all the time and try to help them out as much as I can. I've gotten to know a lot of the big name authors, and they're just as helpful. I mean, they've answered questions for me and helped me guide my career a little bit. It's like I was just in Budapest. I'd never been there before, but I've had I think 6 or 7 books have come out in that country so far. And I had about 1,000 people that showed up for my talk and my book signing, in some foreign country in a little town, So like you can't beat that kind of feeling.
That is amazing. So what are you working on next? Like what's kind of keeping you going right now?
Do you remember a movie from the 90s called Flatliners?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of a cult classic. It was made in 1990. It's got Julia Roberts in it, Kiefer Sutherland, Kevin Bacon, Billy Baldwin, like all these big name stars, but at the start of their career, so nobody really knew who they were at the time. It's about med students who flatline each other to try and figure out if there's life after death. So they literally kill each other to see what they can find. It's been one of my favorite movies my entire life. The guy who wrote it, his name is Peter Filardi. He was actually involved on Dracul, the film project. So I got to know him really well. And a while back, I kind of planted a seed. I said, listen, I've got an idea to reboot this franchise. At the time, Columbia, the studio, still owned the rights, so he couldn't do anything. But he called me back last January, about a year ago, and he said, hey, I got the rights back if you still want to do this. So we hashed out an idea to basically reboot the film franchise, but with a novel. So I'm right now. I just finished up the first draft on it, and it's this crazy take on that original tale, but we're spinning it in a totally new direction. I'm kind of bringing it into the current century.
That's amazing. That is fantastic. How often are you on the road promoting your previous books and stuff? I wonder.
It was quite a bit, then when COVID hit, everything went to Zoom. I think the publishers wanted it to stay on Zoom because it's a lot cheaper to do a Zoom call than it is to, put an author on an airplane and send them to some strange place. But what we found is that it's not as effective. Like doing an actual book tour, going to a bookstore in some place you've never been before, actually shaking hands and meeting people. It just works so much better. Like you can't replicate that with a video call. So it's starting to pick back up again. I'd have to look at my schedule, but I think I've got 5 or 6 international trips planned for this year, and I'll be in random places around the country.
That's amazing. Yeah, how fulfilling does it is it, meeting the folks that that you're kind of fueling their imaginations and their nightmares.
That's the best part of this. I mean, that kind of fuels my fire. It keeps me going. Like being like in Budapest and talking to people in a foreign country that are reading your words, that you put together. Putting books down in front of you and saying, "This is my favorite book I've ever read," like that kind of thing. Like that's priceless.
That's amazing. Now, where can folks find your work and find you online?
The easiest place to find anything about me is jdbarker.com. I've got a number of books coming out. We Don't Talk About Emma comes out in February. I've got that one sitting here behind me. I've got a new book with James Patterson called The Writer coming out in March, and the one we were just talking about, Something I Keep Upstairs, comes out in May.
That's awesome. Well, I have you. Tell me a little about We Don't Talk About Emma, since it's the one coming out next.
I've been, working with Patterson. He kind of gave me the bug to work with co-authors again. So I've been bringing in co-authors of my own. So with this particular book, I worked with a guy named E.J. Feindorf who lived in New Orleans. So me as an author, if I want to write a book in New Orleans, I can hop on Google. I can kind of fake my way through it and learn enough to be able to, create a story that sounds realistic. But, having somebody like him who's lived there, who knows the streets inside and out, knows the people, that authentic voice, bringing that to the writing table, it's a huge valuable asset when actually putting a book together. So in this particular one, it's a story about a serial rapist who gets off on a technicality. The police officer who arrested him, the detective, she blames herself. So in the middle of the night, she sneaks off to his house. She's got a gun in her hand. She's ready to end this guy's life. She finds him in the garage, sitting in his car with his throat slit. Somebody beat her to it. And in her mind, she immediately knows who it was. His last victim was a girl named Emma. So the whole story is basically her trying to track down Emma to basically rein her in.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. I can't thank you enough for making some time for me and talking to me. And I am excited to see what comes next for you. Thank you so much, JD.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.